Our next speaker is a California speaker, originally here from Reading. He's been growing Carnivorous plants for 9 years, focusing mainly on Sarasota, and he's been conducting Darlingtonia research for the past 3 years. James Chilton. Darlingtonia, Ecology and Conservation. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Darlingtonia. It's fairly local to the area. And to start off with the ecology of Darlingtonia, its growth habits and its relations to the rest of the forest. Its habitat is from north of Highway 80, so north of Lake Tahoe, and its range extends all the way up to about Tillamook, which is not too far south of Portland on the Oregon coast. You can find it growing with Drosera rotundifolia, Anglica, as well as Pinguicula vulgaris, I believe, although I'm not very well versed, Pinguicula, and then Atriculare as well. It grows from almost sea level along the Oregon coast up to just about 7,000 feet around Mount Eddy and around Salina Ridge, the Sierra Nevadas and the coastal ranges. Throughout its range, it enjoys cool nights and cool soils, and the soil varies quite a bit. It can be acidic to basic, depending on what the soil is composed of. You can have it from thick peat to little more than serpentine gravel, and serpentine is very ultramafic, so the soil there tends to be very basic. So to touch on some of the major habitat types, this is a picture of myself conducting some research out east of Highway 3 along Trinity Lake. And so this is an example of probably what can best be described as a fin. And so a fin for these plants is usually a mostly horizontal surface where the water will pool. Although Darlingtonia sites, the water is never truly stagnant in them. It does drain. These plants are fed by aquifers and springs year-round. The next site that you will usually find them in is a seep. These are hillsides. Going out, I believe it's Tuesday, on the ICPS trip to the Darlingtonia country. This is actually out around Gasky. This is one of Harry Trayon's sites, so you all may very well see it. This is a serpentine outcropping. There's a spring at the top, and it's purely serpentine gravel. And so the plants grow straight through this. There's little to no actual soil besides the decomposing leaves of the plants and the sedges that accompany them. And then you'll see them also in riparian areas. So a lot of times these fens and seeps will drain down into creeks, and the plants will grow alongside of the creek. And so throughout the plant's range, you can pretty much break it up into two major categories of climate. We have coastal, which is around Gasky, which is a little inland, and then up through the Oregon coast. We have areas that experience generally mild summers compared to the climate inland, and then mild winters as well. Along the northern California coast at least, it will occasionally dust snow on the beach, and it will freeze and frost at night. But there are not any prolonged frosts. Whereas in the mountains, things like the coastal ranges of the northern Sierra Nevadas where the plants grow, the temperatures can fluctuate quite a bit. In the summers, the temperatures can be in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the winters they can drop below freezing for extended periods of time. Let's see here. And these plants can be buried in feet of snow for all winter. This right here is one of the boggiest sites I found. I wanted to touch on real quick. Because most California botanists that you talk to will tell you that there are no bogs in California. And the way I understand bogs is that they're usually fed by rainwater, not groundwater. And because we live in a Mediterranean climate here, all of these wetlands are fed by groundwater year-round, fed from the snow that feeds the aquifers, that feeds the springs. So this site is just off of the North Fork of the Trinity River. Rather lovely photo of my boots sinking in it. But this is probably about 1 foot to 2 feet of peat or peat-like matter with water that stands above the surface of the soil. And there's a fin above it that goes up the hill, and then it drains down, and it would seem stagnant, but it does drain into the Trinity River, although very slowly. This site is also interesting in that it's the only occasion I've ever found Darlingtonia and Equisetum horsetails growing side by side in such a marshy environment. So we have the plants range here, a rather crudely made map by myself. But you can see this is Highway 80, right around here, and that's Salina Ridge. So we have a few different clusters of sites. The plants range is rather disjointed. So we have a site around Salina Ridge, and then another one around Quincy in Plumas County. There's another cluster of sites around Trinity Lake, both to the west and the east of it. And then there is sites all around the Smith River and the drainages leading into it, as well as sites up in the Siskiyou National Forest in the Medford-BLM area. A little north, you get up into Goose Bay, another BLM jurisdiction, and then the Siuslaw National Forest, which is also where Darlingtonia Wayside is, off of Highway 101. Unfortunately, the plants out there are not very well documented. So it is rather sketchy as to where their ranges is, and that's why that box is just kind of, all-encompassing a rather large strip of the coast. But Darlingtonia can serve an important role in forest ecology as a whole. The wetlands it inhabits can be fragile, and they can be indicators of climate change and the effects it can have on the forest. So the plants within the wetlands too are rather sensitive, especially to drought and to prolonged heat. So as I'm sure if any of you are local, you are familiar with the drought that I think has officially been declared over, but it has had a lasting impact on the plants. Many sites still around the outer edges of the fens and working in, the Darlingtonia are dead from the long drought and from the prolonged heat. According to Andreas Fleischmann, Darlingtonia death because of heat, and probably in part because of drought other than just the lack of water that kills the plant, is caused by a phytopathogenic fungus that lives within the plant. And now this is, if any of you have grown healing flora and have been unfortunate enough to deal with the so-called healing flora sudden death syndrome, this is supposed to be a very similar species of fungus to that as well. So it lives within the cells of the plant, and it reproduces asexually. And while temperatures are low, it doesn't seem that it interacts with the plant tissue negatively or positively, really. But as soon as temperatures are kept above a certain threshold for a longer period of time, the fungus switches from asexual to sexual reproduction and sends out hyphae throughout the tissues of the plant. And it clogs the vascular bundles of the plant. And so that's why, especially with healing flora, you will see with certain conditions that the plants will die from the crown out while the tips of the leaves remain green. I've had this happen to myself a few times, unfortunately, usually after divisions. And it can be rather nasty. This is a photo just to show on Highway 36 of the winter there, that's about 3 feet of snow on the side of the road piled up. In certain areas it'll be taller than your car, so a good 5 to 6 feet. This as well is drought damage. That doesn't really look like much other than just like a massive brown with some grasses or sedges sticking out of it. But at one point in time, there's a rather lively clump of Darlingtonia that is withered away because of a lack of water at that site. And besides the fungus that lives in the plant, there are a couple other notable organisms that live communally with the plant. Its pollinator. I know there's been some contention about this. And I believe the mining bee, Andrina nigrita, is generally regarded to be the pollinator of the plant, or at least one of the pollinators of the plant. And then at least one or more species of midge actually lay their eggs and their larvae reside in the pitchers of the plant. And these larvae do a lot of the heavy lifting for the plant. And Darlingtonia, as per current at least, is thought to not produce any kind of digestive enzymes or acids to help it break down its prey. So the midges actually devour the prey for the plant, and their waste is either absorbed by the plant or is further broken down by bacteria and protists, which is then absorbed by the plant much more efficiently. And really, why produce enzymes when you don't have to? If the midges are going to do it for you, it seems easy. But because of its relations with other plants or other organisms, its capacity to be a good forest indicator of forest health, it would seem imperative that there be some kind of monitoring for the plant or conservation for it. And most people generally regard the plant as safe, tucked away in the mountains of Northern California and Southern Oregon, which in a large part it is, but there are a few things that threaten it. As I've touched on already, the drought has had rather drastic effects the past 4 to 5 years. I haven't seen a site fully extirpated by it, but very many have been severely damaged by it. And sites like this, Darlingtonia tends to produce asexually more than sexually. It does seed, but it seems that the seedlings generally have a very low survival rate in the sites. And so the destruction of individuals in a site can lead to further inbreeding and the decline of certain sites. And then fire. This is out around, I believe, the Antelope Fire in Plumas County. And these trees and this fire is about 12 years old. This isn't a Darlingtonia site, but this is an example of a hillside. And these fires out in heavily forested areas can be so intense that they create moonscapes for decades after. Especially in times of drought and prolonged heat. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Carr Fire that burned up around Redding. There's the Klamath Fire, which is threatening to kind of cut in on the trip up to the Darlingtonia country. And then there's the fire around Clear Lake, which I believe is still burning. So this summer has been rather nasty for it, and these fires definitely have the potential to damage or completely destroy sites. The Carr Fire in particular has actually gotten quite close to some Darlingtonia sites out around Trinity Lake. So besides fire, there is the effects of human and urban development that can threaten the plants. While not huge, and definitely not on the scale that we see with like Sarracenia, which has lost a considerable portion of its range, even recently, to land development, we see that property owners that own Darlingtonia sites are usually loath to upkeep them at all. And so this happens, there's a pattern of neglect that goes on, even with federally owned lands, where Darlingtonia sites are not upkept. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Rebecca Merritt Austin, who around the turn of the 19th to 20th century actually did a lot of research on the plants out around Ketty in Plumas County. And the site that she did a lot of her research on, which is actually kept at the Harvard Museum, her site has disappeared because it has been overgrown and outshaded by a lot of trees and shrubs that have moved in on the area. This happened over the course of about 15 years. The site, the canopy, became rather dense, and various shrubs moved in on the area. And despite numerous trips out there to survey, myself and other Forest Service officials, botanists, were unable to find any Darlingtonia. And while it's possible that, erosion could have sloughed away the site, which does happen in certain areas, it would seem much more likely that because of the dense vegetation there, the plants were choked out. And while Darlingtonia can persist in low light conditions for a number of years, it cannot persist indefinitely, unfortunately. And in low light conditions, the plants tend not to flower as well. So it's really a downhill slope for them. So the destruction of the forest surrounding the plants as well, even if the fire does not burn over the fin, can have drastic effects on it. This can change hydrology, can cause erosion. Sites can be, because the areas are so wet and the soil is so loose, whole sites can be washed away down mountains. This has happened on the Medford BLM area, and it usually happens about every season with the snow melt. portions of fins are just washed off the sides of mountains, and that's natural. However, with sites like this, especially in burned areas, the mudslides are rather catastrophic. And besides threatening, Darlingtonia sites can threaten lakes, infrastructure, and even buildings, human-made buildings. And then besides that, we have the effects of grazing. So a lot of old cattle families grazed their cattle out on the northern Sierra Nevadas long before the Forest Service was created or any kind of federal entity fully serviced that land. And so after the Forest Service and the BLM were created, because those families had been there first, they were allowed to continue to graze their cattle out there. And so they have easements. They don't own the land, but they're allowed to use it. And you can see here that cows, unfortunately, their hooves are rather small compared to their body weight, and they pockmark the fins. And so this can create, roughly, softball-sized holes in the fins, and with enough of these, they can form kind of rudimentary streams and gullies through the fin. And this will erode anywhere from just a portion of the fin to the whole thing. Because the water, rather than percolate slowly through the fin, which is seen usually in Darlingtonia sites, will take the path of least resistance and flow through the just stream in the middle of it. So this can wash away considerable portions of the inner part of the fin and then leave the outer portions rather dry and inhospitable to the plants. There's also been concerns with poaching of the plants too. Usually not on a large scale, and usually not by individual hobbyists, fortunately. But local nurseries around the North Coast have been fined rather drastically by the Six Rivers National Forest because they've been caught going out to areas around the Smith River and significantly reducing the size of populations out there by stealing plants. I know if you talk to Harry Trayon, he will probably tell you about sites that he's noticed decreasing rather mysteriously. Plants have gone missing. And then not as much of a concern anymore since its legalization, but there is a considerable amount of marijuana farming that still occurs on public lands. And this can steal water from the seeps and the springs that feed these plants, as well as the chemicals that are used to grow the plants can damage areas that are wetlands. They use harsh pesticides and herbicides, which can leak into these areas and drastically damage them. As well as the fertilizers too. I'm sure most people know that fertilizers can have a rather adverse effect on carnivorous plants, and especially in high dosages. So the runoff from these areas can burn the roots of the plants and the foliage and destroy them. And then as well, past damages. It's not just current things that have been happening with Darlingtonia. Hydraulic mining, which hasn't been done on any large scale in quite some time, but used to be, out in the Sierra Nevadas and not so much in the Cascading coastal ranges, but washed away whole mountainsides. And many of those places were wet, probably seeps and spring sides that were used for the water. And so it seems like that a considerable portion of the plant's range could have been destroyed by that before it was ever cataloged. And that hydraulic mining could have prevented any kind of cataloging before people like John Moore and other conservationists came in to kind of play with that. As well, in certain archives, you can find pictures of the Sacramento flea market circa 1905, and they have a huge stand set out there with hundreds and hundreds of Darlingtonia plants. And I doubt anyone at that point in time was running a rather large Darlingtonia nursery. And so these plants were more than likely poached. And so it seems like many of the places that were either easy to get to or rich in gold were probably destroyed. And so we could be looking at a range for the plant that is already drastically reduced. Not in the terms of Sarracenia, we're only here like 2 to 3% of the plant's historic range is left. But it definitely seems, especially considering how disjointed the range of the plant is, if you remember the map I showed you earlier, I'll skip back to it, that there's rather just like pockmarks of the plants. And it seems odd, especially considering that the seeds of the plants, per my own just kind of rudimentary studies, do not seem to adhere well to fur or to clothing. Generally, they're spread by wind and water, it seems. And they do not seem to last either. So, they don't seem to establish any kind of seed bank in the soil, because they'll get wet and they'll either immediately germinate or, for the most part, rot. So any seeds that are present either germinate immediately or are destroyed. So the opportunity for these seeds to last a long time and to spread to other places is rather low. As well as any kind of animal carrying. The seeds, despite being barbed, the small hooks on Darlingtonia seeds don't seem very adept at clinging onto things. Rather, it seems that they kind of capture pockets of air to help them float on water. And so anything else too, like ingestion by animals, seems unlikely as well, since these seed pods are not fleshy. They're rather kind of dry and leathery. And the seeds are, I would imagine, unpleasant to eat, rather dry and pokey. So it would seem, at least, that the plant suffers from a disjointed range, and that at one point in time, we probably saw a range that existed either from North Lake Tahoe more or less continuously up towards Portland, that is now fragmented. Now, a large portion of that may not be to human interference. Geological upheaval and past climate change before written memory could have well done that. Around this area between the Cascades and the northern Sierra Nevadas is the Modoc area, and that is rather dry. It's generally regarded as a desert, and there are no wetlands there, to my knowledge, that could allow Darlingtonia to grow. And so that would seem that rather than human interaction, geological action segmented the plant's range. And then up through the north, however, from Trinity Lake all the way to Tillamook, there are more or less common areas that Darlingtonia could well grow in. And why it does not is sort of a mystery. And as well, northern into Washington and British Columbia, there are also places that the Darlingtonia could grow, that it just does not. And that could be because of past glaciation and because the plants seem rather slow to spread to new sites. But people have actually introduced, much to the chagrin of some naturalists, Darlingtonia outside of Seattle and in British Columbia in certain wetlands out there. And in the last presentation, she showed a photo of a Sarracenia purpurea in Norway, I believe. And so the plants can be invasive up there. But it definitely shows that they have the capacity to exist in sites that are rather close to where they historically occur. So, current conservation that's going on right now is not a whole lot. There's not, a North American Darlingtonia Conservancy like there is a North American Sarracenia Conservancy. Nor is there necessarily a need for one at the moment. But it does seem, to me at least, like it would be a good idea to catalog the sites in their entirety, or close to it at least. I'm sure there's very many sites, and just a rough, cluster estimation would be sufficient. And to at least kind of start like a seed bank of the plants. In my research that I've been doing, I've been going out with federal permits and collecting seed on the order of about 200 seed per cluster populations. And if that seems like a lot, Darlingtonia seed pods usually hold anywhere from 4 to 1,000 seeds per pod, so I'm collecting a rather minute amount. And then looking at the seedling morphology as well. So in my efforts to kind of catalog the sites, and more than just catalog them, identify which sites may be better able to survive any correlative climate change or other stresses, I wanted to identify sites that were had higher levels of genetic diversity than other sites, because an inbred site is probably not going to fare as well in the long run. As a site with a lot of hybridization just between individuals. And so I've been looking at the seedling morphology, and I don't know if all of you remember, but it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago in the ICPS newsletter, John Brittanacker published a small study on the seedling morphology of Darlingtonia, and I'll admit his photos are much better than mine. He has a nice camera. But just on the rates of mutations that occur between different populations, and he sampled plants from around Gasky and then from around Trinity Lake and compared them. And the rates were different, although his sample size wasn't necessarily very large. I've tried to follow that up. And what I have found is that generally, the lower the germination rate and seemingly the more inbred the site is, the higher the rates of seedling mutation are. And so if you're not familiar with Darlingtonia seedlings, which not many people are because they are tiny and counting them is akin to my own personal hell, but they have two cotyledons, a true grass-like leaf, and then a juvenile pitcher. And so you can see here in this example, the plant is lacking a small grass-like leaf, and the cotyledons have fused on that one side. To provide another example, we see here that it's got two cotyledons and then two grass-like leaves instead of a first pitcher. And then this one is rather interesting. The pitcher is to the right and to the left. It's rather blurry, I'm sorry. Is a grass-like leaf that is kind of folded over on itself, forming kind of pseudoform pitcher. There's a lot of variation here, and it's kind of like a spectrum rather than a discrete group. I found a lot of different forms, and I don't ever hope to catalog them all, but rather to use them as a kind of baseline as to which populations may be suffering from more genetic inbreeding than others. Because, you know, if we can identify the sites that have higher levels of genetic diversity, hopefully we can, you know, recommend those sites and make sure that they are conserved and taken care of first in case that there is ever a need to do so, because those sites will likely be able to weather any kind of change better than other sites would. And so looking into this, I'm still in the process of going through it all. It's been the past 3 years. I've still got a lot of statistical analysis to do with it, but the results do seem promising so far, and hopefully, since I'm a student at HSU in the botany section there, I can follow this up with a molecular test on the plants to see if this actually holds any water and if this can be used in the future to help preserve the plant's range and preserve populations that are you know, more fitting to be preserved. And so I really think that Darlingtonia in its present form doesn't have the range it used to. How much that range has been destroyed, I'm not sure. I'm not at any liberty to say percentage-wise. But I think it's obvious because of its disjointedness. And you know, the gap between populations is much farther than any modern pollinator could fly. Sometimes in the order of 10 miles, sometimes in the order of 100. So I think it is important to know that, and that I'd like to encourage everyone to be aware of the plant's conservation status, and if possible to assist with conservation groups that help with them and with Darlingtonia's relatives. The Forest Service and the BLM, you know, they do need volunteers and they do go out and manage these sites. They need people to go out and thin sites as well as help with control burns. The California Native Plant Society occasionally does things with it as well. And so, you know, if we can help safeguard these sites, I think we can really help maintain the plant's range in its current state and the plant's genetic diversity, hopefully into the long run, in the face of changing climate and of other adversities that the plant faces. So thanks for coming to my speech. Thanks for coming to the ICPS conference, and I hope you guys have a great rest of it. So any questions?
So with climate change, I mean, Oregon already has a population. Is anybody considering helping out or like moving some of the plants into habitat that doesn't have it now but is supportive of it to help expand its range into, it's obviously in the state, but move it a little more north or fill in the gaps between?
I've discussed that with other people, and it seems to be kind of a dichotomy between naturalists, because some people think that it's great, you know, to help preserve the plant and spread it in the face of, you know, existing populations declining, while other people think that, you know, introducing a plant to where it's not native is degrading the site that it's in. So I think it really depends on who you talk to. I am personally not in favor of introducing the plants to where they're not native, rather of just trying to preserve the sites that they already exist in.
Would you support introducing new plants to spread population?
It depends. If those sites are already on the downhill rather drastically and there are other sites nearby, It would seem like it would be a waste, especially if the site was small, if there are other plants nearby that were genetically similar that could survive. If the site was isolated, like some of the sites on the Tahoe National Forest are, they have 13 sites total that they safeguard. Then it might be a good idea to help preserve those sites in the long run. I didn't mention it with the cattle grazing, but they actually go out there and anything above about 1 foot tall they graze off. So those sites, they don't flower anymore. So sexually they're non-reproductive. So something like that could help, but there's other things that need to be taken into account too.
So I checked the IUCN list and it's listed as least concern. So is there any attempts that you know of people trying to get it listed as threatened or?
I thought about it personally, you know, trying to get something relisted, because the plants was listed on Sites Appendix 2 until about 1999, I believe, and then it was demoted. Trying to get it relisted seems daunting. I'm not familiar with the process. I've only looked into it a little bit. My main concern has been starting a conservation group around it. So in the event that, you know, it doesn't get relisted, there can still be something done.
Are the seeds orthodox, and if so, how long can they be stored? And if the seed germination is so low, have you tried alternative besides traditional seed sowing, such as tissue culture, where you have a higher, possibly get a higher percentage of seed germination?
Yeah, I've thought about it. The thing I was touching on, I know in vitro that seeds tend to germinate better, but in situ, the seeds are exposed to a much harsher climate, so they tend not to germinate as well. And the plants that do germinate tend to have very low survival rates, unfortunately. And then these seeds on site will typically not last past a season. However, stored in a refrigerator, they could last indefinitely just with declining germination rates year after year because of long-term storage.
Have you done pollination?
I haven't done any hand pollination with Darlingtonia. I've only collected seed from wild plants for my research.
It was all pollinate usually, that's what it seems wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to speak to that question, in horticulture, I've had fresh Darlingtonia seeds without any cold stratification and achieve almost 100% germination. So with fresh seeds in the right media, you can actually have incredibly high germination rates.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Just thank you for this excellent talk. I've been obsessed with this plant since I began with carnivorous plants. Just to speak with the idea of the conservancy idea, I live in British Columbia. I've never seen Darlingtonia in the wild until a few days ago, and I was just floored by how striking and beautiful this plant is. And almost speaking to our conservancy talk a few days ago about the perception, say, Southeast Asia of weeds in our backyards, you know, I'd be really careful about underestimating how what you have here and what it means to protect it, and how restoration is so much more difficult than conservation. So just as an outsider coming into here, I'm just floored that you have this magnificent plant in the habitat that it exists, and I'd want to be as proactive as possible about keeping it around.
Yeah, thank you. That was my thought as well. Darlingtonia is not anywhere near as threatened as Saracenia right now, it seems. But you know, it would be a good idea to protect it before it would ever get to that point.
Right, and with the history of Saracenia loss, you know, and how rapidly it can occur, you know, anyways. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
You were speculating on the possible reasons why the range is broken up the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that if it were a relatively recent phenomenon, that you wouldn't have too much variation in the plants from one area to another, whereas if it happened a long time ago geologically, for example, that you might have some differences in the cluster of plants in one area than in the other. So is that noticed at all?
Well, typically with Darlingtonia, there is only one form of it recognized that I know of. That is Weirtiflora. I think it was previously known as Othello by Barry Rice. It was in Anthocyon in free form, found on a property managed by the Barry Land Trust. And besides that, there are no other recognized taxa of Darlingtonia at all. So across its range, it is very uniform for the most part. There are different colorings and different, you know, tongue or fishtail appendage kind of forms, but nothing that has been formally cataloged and nothing that seems very drastic.
I was kind of surprised. I was going to ask you about seed bank, and I was so surprised that when you said that it didn't form any perspective, that seems like that would be a great logical adaptation to survive fires and things like that. So I'm curious, especially considering what's going on, is there anything that Darlingtonia has in its growth habitat that helps protect it from those fires, which would clear out all that overgrowth and allow it to get all light?
Well, usually a light fire over the fen wouldn't destroy the plants. It would actually help them because it would clear off like the Saracenian invading shrubs or their tall plants that would outgrow them. But the plants spread rather prolifically from their stolons. They clone themselves very quickly. And so that's good for repopulating a site, but it's bad for your genetic diversity as a whole.
So this is in response to what you said. I've done a little bit of breeding recently, Darlingtonia, a lot of breeding actually. But I found out that they have a similar adaptation to Saracenia with shielded rhizome, so usually they survive fires quite effectively.
Thank you. Yeah, it would have to be a very intense fire to destroy a fen, but we do see them sometimes in the areas I showed you, like with the moonscape after the fire, where things haven't grown really for 10 years because the fire was so hot that it killed the seed bank of even the conifers, which their seeds are made to usually survive fires and then grow after them.
Do you know if anyone's looked at levels of homozygosity within these subpopulations to see if there is actual genetic evidence of isolation or lack of sexual reproduction?
No, not a whole lot. The only work I know of is John Brittenacker's that he did a little bit of, and then what I'm trying to do at the moment. Besides that, I don't think any kind of census has really been undertaken to look at the different infraspecies and any kind of genetic variations within populations or even across the plant's range, unfortunately.
So you mentioned about the follow-up action found by Dr. Fletcher, and that is on Darlingtonia as well as Darlingtonia.
Yeah, it's thought to be the same at least.
Right. And in cultivation, especially for us, people from New Zealand, very struggle to grow them successfully. I think it's mostly because it's very hard to keep them in school.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that fungal infection is the major cause of the those dying when the temperature is kept high?
I would think so. I haven't seen any formal research on it, only comparisons of it to Helium flora, and it definitely seems similar. And I do believe there's a species of fungus that lives within Darlingtonia, but a comparison of the two hasn't been undertaken, both in their living habits and how they kill the plant. But it would seem that when the root temperature rises, that they die in a very similar way.
I see. So it hasn't been confirmed that I see.
No, not to my knowledge at least.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
When you want to wish for conservation, you have to keep in mind what happened with Saracenia albumensis and Oreophila, is when they were listed, the farmers went out on their private land and plowed them under because they didn't want to have those plants on their private land. If you go to Mount Eddy, most of the best sites are on privately held within the national forest. I don't think the owners would actually do that there. But those are issues where you're actually drawing more attention to the plant, you're making it more rare, more desirable. And I don't think that that's really, so you really need to think hard before you do something like that.
Yeah, that is definitely true. Fortunately, a lot of the sites out there are owned by logging companies as well throughout the plant's range. And companies like SBI are usually pretty compliant with federal law. And I've talked to them before. They employ botanists on their staff. And they tend to tiptoe around the fence to make sure that nothing is done because they are protected areas. If not for the Darlingtonia, for other wetland plants that live there. But that is a great point and a good consideration I haven't thought of. Thank you. Any other questions?
I would just interject, if you read the very first article in the very first CPN about Saracenia Oreophila, they talk about how much of it there is, and they didn't know how to grow them back then, and they were digging them up to try and make them grow, which wasn't what wiped them out. But I was talking recently with Barry Rice about this, and we have a weird idea with conservation, where we don't really get involved to say something until it's on the ropes already, and so we have this weird way of kind of rooting for the losers, and then waiting until something like this becomes a loser to jump on in. So I would say that although I've seen lots and lots of Darlingtonia in the wild, we used to say, look at all these Oreophila in the wild, and it's super important to conserve it. Great talk, James.
Thank you.